Hello all, today I want to talk about intelligence and more specifically testing intelligence. I want to kind of go through the history of how people have tested intelligence in the past and why this can lead to certain problems in the modern day in the way we test intelligence and the way we use IQ scores to determine people's utility in society. So the concept of intelligence and intelligence testing is instrumental. It can be described as trying to measure the efficacy of mental functioning. And more recently, you could argue as the West try and adopt more meritocratic values and move towards a meritocracy, it's almost becoming shorthand for moral worth or cognitive ability. Now, no one would argue that modern IQ tests can objectively measure one's intelligence, but advocates for it would say it's the best method we have. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it's limited and we have different types of things being assessed with different IQ tests. You can have a test for vocabulary, short-term memory, arithmetics, or even learned knowledge. On the other side of the argument, you have some who suggest it's a form of governance. It kind of echoes the Foucault analysis of a surveillance capitalism, where we're just trying to prioritize societal productivity and efficiency. So we're really trying to know who's got the best intelligence or who's got the best ability for developing resources at an efficient rate. And in an age defined by computational innovation, it almost dictates the opportunities available for you. Now, as I said earlier, no one would say that these are completely objective tests. There are, of course, social factors that come into play when IQ tests are made. So their classification of results or the choosing of certain questions over others. They have an element of social bias in them. Now, what's historically been controversial about IQ tests is its apparent link with class or race. And these are according to various statistics. So those who study human intelligence can often be placed on a continuum between the hereditarian view and an environmentalist view. So essentially whether your IQ or your intelligence is completely genetically determined or it's completely environmentally determined. In 1994, Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray's The Bell Curve depicted a grim reality in American society. In their cross-analysis of dozens of reputable studies, they found that African Americans and European Americans had a different IQ test on average of about 1 standard deviation. So this equates to the average white person in America having the IQ test score of over 84% of the African American population. And in turn, the average black person has a higher IQ than just 60% of the white population in America. Herrnstein and Murray then defend how these statistics persist even when accounting for loads of environmental factors. And so this essentially suggests that there are some innate differences in IQ or intelligence abilities between African Americans and white Americans. So let's do a bit of a history regarding IQ testing and sort of where it comes from. So Francis Galton was behind the initial attempts to link intelligence with race in the late 19th century. So what's tricky when analysing Galton's work is that we don't know what exactly is science and what exactly stems from his ideological commitment to white superiority. Galton, however, would use anthropometry to measure intelligence, so the measurement of cranial structures rather than some sort of mental testing. Similarly, Robert Bennett Bean, a physician in Virginia, corroborated on a number of Galton's views in 1906, and he did an experiment where he measured the cranial structures of African Americans and compared them to white Americans, and he found that there was a significant difference. So he described the black American as the intermediary between the man and the orangutan. Now, what's interesting about Bean's work is that his mentor, Franklin P. Moore, became suspicious because his work was almost too good. So what did he do? He repeated his studies, but now doing a blind study. So that meant that he didn't know prematurely which skulls belonged to African Americans and which skulls had belonged to white Americans. After repeating Bean's work, he found no difference in the relative sizes of their brains. As Stephen Jay Gould concludes, prior prejudice, not copious numerical documentation, dictates conclusions. Gould suggests that any deduction of black inferiority from apparent brain sizes required the presupposition of white superiority. And so with a lot of this work, the line between the scientific and the social is unclear. Over the 20th century, what was initially a concept to segregate one race of humans from another becomes a scientific fact of nature. And so this video is not to say that intelligence as a construct has no instrumental utility, but to link it with racial groups is a social decision that is not objectively inferred by the science or the technology. It's a social choice of classification, which has now become interwoven with the science of intelligence itself. And Eric Siegel points out that nowhere in the Bell Curve does the book address why it investigates racial differences in IQ. And so linking IQ to race is a social norm, it's not dictated by the science itself. So the shift of intelligence measurement from anthropometry to mental testing began with the work of French psychologist Alfred Binet. He was commissioned by the Minister of Public Education in France to develop ways to identify children who may need special treatment in a classroom. Binet put together a series of tasks and observed how these children progressed through increasingly challenging tests that he associated with distinct mental ages. Thus the IQ score was born. Binet emphasised empirical testing over theoretical speculation, yet he clarified that IQ tests should only be used on students who seem to be struggling and not everyone. So following from that, it was primarily the work of three American psychologists, H. Goddard, L.M. Terman and R.M. Yerkes, which led to the widespread use of IQ score tests to denote one's intelligence and subsequently their utility and worth. Yerkes was a psychologist during a time when the field was particularly stagnant and lacked authority. He saw an opportunity during World War I to market IQ tests to the American military. This could help as a way to categorise recruits into positions of responsibility. And he was successful. 1.75 million recruits were tested. And then from this point, inquiries from schools and businesses came flooding in to see how this new science could be of use to them. Now, alongside this came the idea of hereditary intelligence and group differences. So Goddard and Terman wrote about the feeble-minded and morons, who were those scoring low on their IQ tests, as if they were a type of human that was predestined to be in their lower classes. They seemed to advocate for a world not too dissimilar from the dystopian of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. The IQ test score functions as a form of intermediary discourse. It communicates scientific findings in a simplified way so that non-experts can get an understanding without getting lost in the information. The risk is that in its simplification we risk overinterpreting its value and not seeing the various limitations in the process of that measurement. With mass testing beginning at a time of mass racial discrimination, lack of educational opportunities would have caused African Americans to score lower disproportionately. So one of the graphs used by Hansina Murray to show the intelligence differences between African Americans and European Americans relies on an overview of studies in cognitive test scores between 1918 to 1990. Yet many of their argument for the minimal involvement of environment in accounting for IQ score differences revolve around an analysis of contemporary American public policy, something that's changed significantly since 1918. And so already by itself, to say that you've analysed environmental factors and you've accounted for them, that's such a complex thing to do. And so on the one hand, just by saying that you've accounted for environmental factors, that's an incredibly complex topic, and it's not quite clear to me how one does that. The sort of span of studies with which they draw from come across from the whole 20th century, and context, especially in terms of racial equality and racial inequality, changes drastically throughout that period. So the only way that this could even to some degree be believable is if they did a specific analysis within the context of each test that they studied. And even then it's not clear that their analysis is exactly good enough or good at all. So Hansina Murray must at least agree that environment played some role in accounting for low IQ scores for African Americans pre-civil rights movement, yet they use this data regardless. So one issue with IQ scores is that they can lead to self-fulfilling outcomes. So when people say IQ scores are a good indicator of one doing well in life, there's also a risk of having a feedback loop. So when one does well in IQ score tests, they have more confidence to then do well in life, and when some doesn't do so good, they may have less incentive to try and do well. So the purpose of the video was just to kind of talk through something that gets spoken about a lot, which is the concept of IQ. And as mentioned in the beginning, with loads of emphasis being placed on moving towards a meritocracy, I think it's really important to talk about inequalities and environmental factors that affect one's ability to develop merit. That's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, or if you have any strong opinions on this, please feel free to leave a comment. Thanks all for watching. If you have any ideas of how I can improve, I'd really appreciate it. But bye for now.